The egg was not supposed to be there. Walter Greer found it the way he found most problems, by nearly stepping on it. He was moving through his turnip bed on a grey spring morning, boots wet from overnight rain, when his heel came down on something hard and hollow-sounding. He stopped. He looked down. A shell the size of a soup pot sat half-buried between two rows, cracked clean across the middle, and something inside it was moving. Walter stood there a moment. He was not a man who panicked easily. He had farmed the border edge of Steadhello colony for 11 years, had buried a wife in the 6th, and had kept farming because the soil did not stop needing tending just because a person was sad. He crouched down, pushed the wet dirt away with one hand, and looked. The thing inside, the egg, looked back at him. It was small, smaller than he expected, though he could not have said what he expected. The scales were blue, a deep, dark blue that caught the pale morning light and threw back something warmer, like gold seen through water. Its wings were folded tight against its body, too small to be useful yet. Its eyes were the color of river stones after rain. It opened its mouth and made no sound, because it was too tired and too new to make sound. Walter picked it up. It fit in both his hands with room to spare. He took it inside, wrapped it in an old work shirt, and heated some fish broth on the stove. He fed it with a spoon, slowly, the way he had once fed a lamb whose mother died in a cold snap. The hatchling ate everything he offered. Then it fell asleep in the shirt on his kitchen table. Walter sat across from it and drank his coffee and thought about things. He knew what it was. Everybody in Steadhello knew what lived east of the colony in the Emberville Range. The colony charter had a full section about it, mostly instructions for what not to do near dragon territory. He was fairly certain that bringing one inside and feeding it fish broth was on the list of things not to do. He refilled his coffee. The hatchling slept. He named it Sable because when the sun finally came through the kitchen window and landed on those scales, the blue and gold moved together like something deep and dark and quietly lit. It seemed like a name that fit. Sable woke up hungry. Walter fed him again. By the second day, Sable had discovered the garden. He walked the rows with the seriousness of a creature twice his size, stopping to sniff each plant, occasionally sitting down in the middle of a path to think. Walter watched from the porch and said nothing. On the third day, Sable slept at the end of the turnip bed and refused to come inside until Walter carried him. The colony's liaison officer, Adira, came by at the end of the first week. She was young, organized, and very tired of Walter in particular. She stood at his garden gate, looked at Sable sitting in the turnip bed, and said several things about the Galactic Union Apex Fauna Accord. Walter offered her coffee. She declined. She wrote several things in her notebook. She left. The ridgefoxes came 2 weeks into spring. They were native to Verdania, low to the ground and fast, with teeth built for roots. They had already cleaned out 3 garden plots on the colony's outer edge before they reached Walter's fence line. He heard them at night, the scratch of claws and the soft thud of something burrowing under the wire. He got up to deal with it. He did not have to. Sable was already there. The hatchling stood in the middle of the garden path, and he was small, barely larger than a boot, but he stood the way something much older would stand. Still, certain, he looked at the ridgefoxes at the fence line, and he made a sound low in his chest that Walter felt more than heard. Not a roar, not a hiss, something older and quieter than either. The ridgefoxes left. They did not come back. By morning, half the colony had heard about it. Orrin, Walter's neighbor, came over before breakfast and stood at the fence looking at Sable in the turnip bed. Sable ignored him. He chased them off, Orrin said. Stood there, Walter said. They left. Orrin was quiet for a moment. How big will he get? Walter looked at Sable, who was sniffing a turnip with great focus. Big, he said. He poured Orrin a coffee. They watched the hatchling patrol the rows. The spring rain came in soft and steady from the east. Sable sat down in it and let it fall on him and seemed to find this entirely acceptable. Walter's fence was dry under the overhang. His garden was weed-free. His ridgefox problem was solved. He thought that things could be worse. They could not have known, that morning, that the Galactic Union was already receiving Adira's first report. They could not have known that a xenobiologist named Dr. Peller had flagged it for review. They could not have known what one spring morning in a turnip bed was going to set in motion. Walter refilled his coffee. Sable kept patrolling. The garden grew. The drought came without warning, the way droughts always do on Verdania, 1 week of less rain becoming 2, becoming a month, and then the sky simply stopped making promises. The colony's irrigation lines could not keep up. Other garden plots went pale and dry at the edges. Leaves curled inward. Fruit came small and tight-skinned and bitter. Walter's garden did not. He noticed it first in the soil. The earth near where Sable slept each night was different, darker, warmer, the kind of damp that only came from deep down. Plants near the hatchling grew faster, stood straighter, held color long after the plots across the lane had given up. Walter pressed his palm flat against the soil one morning and held it there. The warmth came up through his fingers like something breathing. He looked at Sable. Sable was watching a beetle cross one of the path stones. Walter said. That was enough thinking about it. He started placing Sable at the end of each garden row at night, setting him down there with a piece of dried fish and a word of thanks. Sable accepted this as reasonable and slept where he was put. By midsummer, every row in Walter's garden was thriving. Other colonists noticed. They were polite about it at first, then less polite, then they started knocking on Walter's gate before sunrise and asking, with the slightly desperate cheerfulness of people whose crops were failing, whether Sable might consider sleeping elsewhere for a night or two. Sable considered nothing of the sort. He had one garden, he knew which plants were his, he was not interested in other arrangements. Inspector Vayek arrived on a hot afternoon in late summer. He was Korathi, six-limbed, organized, carrying a document case the size of Walter's kitchen table. He came with 17 forms related to the Galactic Union Apex Fauna Accord and a very precise understanding of what violations had occurred. Vayek walked to the garden gate. Sable was there. The hatchling had grown since spring. He was now the size of a large dog, and he did not bark or posture or snarl. He simply stood at the gate and looked at Inspector Vayek the way something looks when it has decided something and does not feel the need to announce what. Vayek stopped walking. He stood on the road and opened his document case and reviewed his forms from there. He completed several checkboxes. He wrote a description of the scene. He ticked a box labeled visual confirmation and did not, at any point, attempt to enter the garden. He filed his report from the road. The box labeled violation status he left, after a long pause, unchecked. He marked the case pending further review and left before supper. Adira watched all of this from her window across the lane. She wrote 3 pages in her field journal that evening and crossed out 2 of them. The fire came in the 3rd week of the dry season. It started east of the colony in the long grass, some equipment fault, some spark in the wrong place. The colony had fire lines, had water pressure, had plans. None of these were enough. The fire moved fast and low, and the wind pushed it toward the outer garden plots, toward the storage buildings, toward 12 families who had not finished the harvest. Colony leader Marin was already calling for evacuation when Sable moved. He walked east through the settlement and past the fence line out into the dry grass ahead of the fire. He was not fast. He was deliberate. He stopped at a point between the fire and the colony, and he began to dig. His claws went through the packed summer earth like it was loose sand. He tore a firebreak trench in long, even lines, working back and forth with the patience of something that does not measure effort by how hard it is. When the trench was wide enough, he stopped digging. He breathed. Not a great roar of flame, a controlled, narrow heat directed along the dry grass ahead of the fire's path. It burned clean and fast and left nothing to feed on. The wildfire reached the blackened ground, found no fuel, and died in stages, settling into smoke. Sable walked back to Walter's garden. He sniffed the turnips. He lay down. No one in Stedhello spoke for almost a full minute. Then Oren said, very quietly, Did he just? Yes, Walter said. Oren thought about this, on purpose. Walter looked at Sable, who had closed his eyes. I expect so, he said. Inspector Vayek, who had not yet left the colony, had witnessed the entire thing from the road. He sat in his official vehicle for a long time. He opened his document case again. He found the form he had left incomplete that afternoon. He looked at the violation checkbox for a while. He closed the case. He started the vehicle. He drove to the shuttle without stopping. His formal report, filed 3 days later, described a routine inspection visit to Steadhello colony. He noted the colony's strong harvest yield. Under additional observations, he wrote 2 words, situation managed. He did not explain what situation. He did not explain how. The Union systems filed it automatically. No one flagged it for review. Summer burned on. Walter's garden kept growing. Sable kept watch from the yard, too big now to come through the door. Walter built him a shelter outside the next morning. He put a window in it facing the kitchen so they could still eat breakfast together. Sable approved of the window. The harvest came in heavy and golden, the kind of autumn that made farmers superstitious. Walter's surplus alone was enough to fill the colony's emergency stores twice over. Other plots had done better too. Some, looking at his methods, had adjusted their watering and spacing mid-season. Steadhello had not eaten this well in years. Dr. Peller arrived with the trade delegation and a deep distrust of everything Adira had written. She was Korathi like Vayek, but where Vayek was a man of forms and checkboxes, Peller was a woman of measurement. She carried instruments instead of documents. She had spent 2 months aboard the delegation ship, reviewing Adira's field reports, cross-referencing them with everything the Galactic Union knew about Verdanian dragon behavior, and concluding that Adira had made several significant errors of observation. Dragons did not form bonds with other species. It was documented. It was agreed upon. The data was clear. She set up an observation post across the road from Walter's property and spent the first 3 days watching Sable from a distance through a set of very good instruments. She noted his size, his patrol patterns, his posture when colony members passed the fence. She wrote everything down in exact language that left no room for feeling. On the 3rd evening, she noted that his behavior showed no signs of aggression and no signs of domestication. He was simply, she wrote, present. She underlined the word and was not sure why. On the 4th day, Sable noticed her lantern had gone out. She was working late, the autumn dark coming early, and her lantern ran dry without her realizing. She reached for it, found it cold, looked up. Sable was standing outside her post. She had not heard him approach. He was the size of a pony now, and he moved without sound when he chose to. He looked at the lantern. He looked at her. He opened his jaw and breathed a small, shaped heat no larger than a candle flame, pointed with precision directly into the lantern's wick. It lit. He walked back to the garden. Pella sat for a long time with her lit lantern and her notebook open to a blank page. She started a new report that night. The harvest festival ran for 3 days, the whole colony moving from plot to plot, gathering and storing and cooking together. Sable watched from inside the garden fence, tracking every unfamiliar face with the quiet attention of a guard who is not alarmed but is counting. He let no one through the gate who Walter had not first greeted. Nobody tried very hard to test this. Late in the 2nd week of autumn, the adolescent dragons came. There were 4 of them, and they appeared at the eastern edge of the settlement just before dusk, young, not fully grown, with the restless energy of creatures who had not yet decided what they were. They were larger than Sable. They made no aggressive move, issued no call. They stood at the field's edge and looked at the colony the way something looks at a thing it has heard about and needs to see for itself. Marin triggered the evacuation alarm. Colonists began moving to the interior buildings. Walter stayed at his porch. Sable walked out of the garden, past the fence, and stood between the adolescent dragons and the settlement. He was smaller than all of them. He made a sound Walter had never heard from him before. It came from deep in the chest, low and sustained, a harmonic that made the air feel thick. It was not a challenge. It was not a warning. It was something more precise than either. Adira's recorder caught it from 30 meters away. The translation unit in her equipment, built for standard Union languages and not calibrated for dragon vocalization, worked on the recording for 11 minutes before returning a result. The closest translation it offered was, "This place is spoken for." The four adolescent dragons stood still. They looked at Sable for a long moment. Then they turned and walked east, back toward the Emberville range, unhurried, as if they had simply confirmed what they came to check. Sable watched them go, then he returned to the garden. The evacuation alarm was still ringing. Marin turned it off. The colony stood in the quiet and looked at each other. Oren was standing near the storage shed with a garden rake, which he slowly set down. "That's it," he said. "They just left." "He told them something," Adira said. She was looking at her translation readout. "What?" She showed him the screen. Oren read it twice. He set the rake down more carefully, as if setting it down hard might be rude. That evening, Walter sat on the porch with a bowl of stew and told Sable about the translation. He did this the way he told Sable most things, directly, without performance, the way one neighbor updates another on what happened while they were busy. Sable listened. He was lying along the outside of the garden fence, and he turned his head slightly toward Walter the way he did when he was paying close attention. And when Walter finished talking, Sable made a small sound, not the deep harmonic, something quieter and shorter, and looked back at the garden. Walter ate his stew. Pella's new report was now 40 pages and growing. She had not slept well in a week. She was not unhappy about this. She was the kind of person who felt most awake when she had been most wrong. The autumn leaves came down in waves across Steadhollow. Sable grew another hand's width through the season, quiet and certain, and he knew every plant in that garden the way he knew his own scales. Snow came to Verdania like it meant to stay. The first hard winter hit Steadhollow in the colony's 6th year, and it hit with the particular patience of a season that knows it has time. Supply lines from the central hub froze out. A territorial dispute in orbit had pulled the Union's attention elsewhere, and no resupply ship was cleared to land until the lawyers finished talking. Marin rationed what she could. The colony ate from its stores and waited. The stores held. Walter's surplus from the autumn harvest was the reason. He did not point this out. He was not the pointing it out type. Sable, for his part, discovered that winter suited him. He liked the cold air. He curled himself around the outside of the garden shed at night, and the ground beneath him stayed frost-free, vegetables in storage staying fresh longer than they had any right to. He did not seem to require much from the cold months. He ate less, moved less, watched more. He was watching when Driscoll's ships came down. 3 salvager vessels, running no Union registry, landed on the flat ground east of the colony just before noon on the worst day of winter. Their crew were humans, 40 of them, armed with the sort of equipment that made very clear what kind of conversation they intended to have. Their captain, Driscoll, was a broad, calm man with a reputation in the outer systems for taking things that belonged to people who were too far from help to stop him. He had charts showing Steadhollow's harvest surplus. Someone had talked. He had come to collect. Marin called an emergency meeting in the community hall. Walter was invited. He did not attend. He was in the yard, sitting on an overturned crate in the snow, eating bread and salt meat the way he ate most breakfasts, and he told Sable about the ships the same way he told Sable everything, simply, without drama. He said that some people had come to take the food, that there were 40 of them, and that Marin was working on a plan. Sable was lying along the fence with his chin on the top rail, watching the eastern edge of the settlement. He went very still when Walter mentioned the ships. His breathing slowed. He made the quiet sound he made when he was deciding something, the same low note Walter had learned to recognize over many months. Then he stood up, walked through the garden gate, and kept walking east. Driscoll's crew had gotten organized by then. They moved in a line toward the colony's storage buildings, and they were confident because 40 armed people almost always had good reason to be confident. The crew in front stopped first, then the ones behind stopped too. Sable was standing, in the road. He was not attacking, he was not making noise. He was standing in the road between 40 armed salvagers and the storage buildings that held food for 300 people, and he was looking at them the way something looks when it has all the time in the world and knows it. Driscoll was a practical man. He gestured to go around. Sable moved. Not fast, not threatening. He simply repositioned, placing himself again between the crew and the storage. Driscoll gestured to split the line. Sable watched the two halves of the line and stepped once to the left, and the crew on that side stopped walking. One of Driscoll's crew fired a warning shot into the air. Sable looked at the weapon. He looked at the man who fired it. He did not move. Driscoll tried negotiation. He was good at negotiation, could read people quickly and find the thing they needed to hear. He started talking, but Sable was not a person in any sense Driscoll's experience had prepared him for. Sable did not need anything Driscoll could offer. He already had his garden, his human, his turnip rows. He was not poor in any way Driscoll knew how to use. Driscoll talked for a while. Sable was quiet. Driscoll ran out of things to say. He made a practical decision. He told his crew they would return when conditions were better. They went back to the ships. Sable followed. When Driscoll got to his ship, Sable was already there, sitting on the landing struts with the full weight of a horse-sized dragon that had chosen a spot and found it comfortable. The struts held. Driscoll's crew could not take off. Driscoll stood at the bottom of the ramp for a long time. Sable looked at the middle distance. After an hour, Driscoll walked back to the road and looked toward the colony, and then looked at the dragon, and then looked at the sky. He was a man who knew when a situation had turned into something he had not planned for. He told his crew to unload their weapons and leave them on the ground. Then he told Sable, very clearly and with the particular sincerity of a man who has made a calculation, that they were leaving. He said they would not be back. Sable stepped off the landing struts. The ships left. They did not come back. Walter asked Sable that evening what he had been thinking about while standing in the road. Sable looked at him for a moment and made a sound. Adira's recorder, which she had started carrying everywhere, caught it. The translation came back after a pause. It said, "Counting." Walter nodded. That seemed right. He brought Sable an extra piece of dried fish that night and sat with him in the snow for a while. The colony's lights were warm across the field. The storage buildings stood full and quiet. Marin formally requested the next morning that Sable be listed in the Stedhalo census. She created a new category for him. It read, Resident Non-Enrolled. Nobody objected. 1 year after a cracked egg turned up between 2 rows of turnips, the Galactic Union sent a diplomat. Not an inspector, not a researcher. An ambassador Teth of the Korathi Concord, who had spent 30 years in difficult postings and was known across the Union for his ability to sit in a room with 2 parties who hated each other and leave 3 hours later with something signed. He arrived aboard a proper diplomatic vessel with a full staff, accompanied by representatives of 2 other Union species, a pair of Veldry, tall and feather-ridged and formal in the particular way of beings who considered formality a kind of respect, and 1 Murathi observer, ancient and slow, and carrying a small carved book she had apparently been adding to for 60 years. 3 separate reports had crossed Teth's desk over the past 12 months, one from Inspector Vaic, which was mostly empty boxes and 2 words, one from Dr. Peller, which was 200 pages and growing, and had recently been circulated to 7 academic bodies. One from Adira, which was a field journal that the Union had requested a copy of, and which read, the Union's analysts said, less like an official report and more like someone watching history and trying very hard to describe it accurately. In 125 years, no dragon had voluntarily remained in extended proximity to a non-dragon species. Teth came to see it himself. The delegation toured Stedhalo first. Marin showed them the storage buildings, the garden plots, the community infrastructure. The Veldry asked careful, polite questions. Teth listened to everything and said little. The Murathi observer walked slowly and looked at things for a long time before moving on. Then Marin brought them to Walter's property. Walter was in the garden when they arrived. Sable was beside him, packing one of the outer rows with his nose close to the soil the way he did when something had grown overnight that he wanted to assess. He was tall at the shoulder now, blue-gold scales thick and bright in the spring light, wings folded neat against his back. Walter looked up. He saw the delegation. He raised a hand in greeting. "Come in," he said. "I'll make coffee." Teth had prepared an introduction. He had, in fact, prepared 3 introductions for different scenarios. He had not prepared for being invited in for coffee before he had spoken a single word. He recovered well because he was good at his work. He introduced himself and the delegation. He explained that the Union had taken a significant interest in the situation at Stedhalo and wished to understand it better. He was measured and clear and professional. Walter handed him a mug. Teth held it and attempted to proceed. He explained that the Union wished to establish formal dialogue and had brought translation protocols for interspecies communication with Verdanian dragon fauna. These protocols were decades in development, the result of careful observation and study. They involved specific postures, specific distances, a specific sequence of movements that signaled non-aggression and request for engagement. He began the protocol. Sable watched. He watched Teth move through the first sequence and the second and part of the third. Then Sable turned, walked to Walter's side, sat down, and looked at Teth with the patience of something waiting for a noise to stop. One of the Veldry representatives made a quiet sound that might have been a cough or might have been something else. Teth lowered his arms. He stood for a moment. He was a man who had learned, over 30 years of difficult work, that the best thing to do when a plan stops working is to stop doing the plan. "What did you do?" he asked Walter. Walter was quiet for a moment. He scratched the back of his neck the way he did when he was thinking about something he had not thought about in a long time. "I fed him," he said, "when he was small, called him by name, didn't treat him like a problem." He paused. "Mostly I just talked to him like a neighbor, don't know what else there was." One of the Veldry requested to transcribe this. Walter said that was fine. He asked if they wanted to see the turnips. The Murathi observer had not spoken during any of this. She moved through the garden slowly, looking at things, and Sable watched her the way he watched the Veldry and Teth, not threatened, not dismissive, simply aware. When she reached the end of the outer row, she stopped, looked at Sable for a long moment, and made a short sound. Sable looked at her. He made a short sound back. No translation unit caught it clearly enough to process. Before the delegation left, the Murathi observer came to Walter's porch. She took from her coat pocket a small carved stone, gray-green and smooth, marked with symbols Walter did not know. She put it in his hand and closed his fingers around it. She said, in Union Standard, that it was given to people who taught something without meaning to. Walter thanked her. He turned the stone over in his hand. He set it on the windowsill next to his coffee jar. Adira was made an offer that afternoon, a seat on a new interspecies advisory commission, a position that had not existed before that morning. She accepted. She asked if she could keep her field journal. They said that the field journal was, in some ways, the reason the commission existed. That evening, Walter sat on the porch in the warm second spring air. The delegation's ship had lifted off an hour ago. The garden was planted. Sable was in the rows, doing what he had always done, moving slow and certain through the things he had decided were worth keeping. The stone on the windowsill caught the last light. Walter looked at it for a while. Then he looked at the garden, then at the dragon in it. Then he went inside to make supper. Nobody planned for Stedhalo to become the kind of place people traveled to see. It happened the way most things happened in the colony, gradually, without announcement, one thing at a time. A Veldry research team applied for a visit. A Korathi journalist arrived on the delegation ship's return trip and stayed 3 weeks. 2 representatives of a species that had never before visited a human colony filed for entry clearance through the Union's standard process. citing a single reason: they had read Dr. Peller's report. The report was now 200 pages. The summary at the front was 4 lines. The last line read, "We have been wrong about dragons." Sable moved through all of it with the same unhurried attention he gave everything. He noticed new faces. He assessed them. He checked them against Walter, the way he had always checked things against Walter, not waiting for instructions, just orienting. If Walter greeted someone with ease, Sable was easy. If Walter was watchful, Sable was watchful. Nobody had taught him this. He had built it from a year of observation. The garden had grown, not because Walter planned it. He was not an ambitious man in that direction, but because Sable's sense of territory had expanded naturally to cover the adjacent plots, whose owners, quietly grateful, had stopped worrying about their fence lines. 4 times the original area, running in long, even rows, producing more than Stedhalo needed and some to spare. A 7-year-old named Petra had started following Sable on his morning patrol. She had not asked. She had simply appeared at the garden gate one morning, small and serious, and fallen into step behind him. Sable had ignored her on the first day. On the second, he glanced back once. On the third, he began adjusting his stride, shortening it slightly, making each deliberate turn a little slower. She kept up. He kept adjusting. By the second week, she was walking beside him rather than behind. Walter watched this from the porch and said nothing, because there was nothing to say about it that the watching didn't already cover. The Veldry research team made their formal request in the 4th week of summer. They wished to study Sable in a controlled environment for a period of 6 months. They had a facility, they said. They had instruments. They had a protocol that would be entirely humane and well documented. Walter read the request. He set it down on the kitchen table. He picked it up again and read it once more. He wrote back a single line, "No, thank you." The Veldry research team wrote a report about the refusal that was, by several measures, more interesting than the study would have been. It was titled "The Limits of Institutional Access" and was later cited in 4 separate papers on the ethics of apex fauna research. The summer ran long and warm and full. Then, on a morning in the 6th week, Sable left. He was gone when Walter came out for breakfast. The garden was quiet in a way that took Walter a moment to place, not wrong, exactly, but empty of a presence so constant he had stopped noticing it consciously. He stood on the porch with his coffee and looked east. The colony noticed too. It went quiet without deciding to. 3 days passed. Nobody talked about it much, the way people don't talk directly about the things they are most uncertain of. On the 4th morning, Sable came back. He came from the east, from the direction of the Emberville Range, flying low over the colony and landing in the outer field with a thud that Walter felt through the porch boards. He was alone for a moment. Then behind him, and at a distance that suggested caution rather than fear, 2 smaller dragons landed. They were young past hatchling, not fully grown, with the careful movements of creatures navigating something unfamiliar. They stayed at the eastern edge of the settlement. They did not come forward. They watched. Walter went inside. He came back out with 2 plates of food, the good stuff, the dried fish he kept for Sable's meals, and he walked to the field's edge, set both plates on the ground, nodded at the 2 young dragons in the unceremonious way he nodded at most things, and walked back to the porch. Sable watched all of this. He sat down in the garden. By evening, both plates were empty. The 2 young dragons were still at the field's edge in the morning. They stayed through the day. By the 3rd day, they had moved slightly closer. By the end of the week, they had settled into a loose orbit around the settlement's eastern edge, present without imposing, visible without demanding anything. Dr. Peller, who had returned to Stedhalo for the summer, sent a 1-line message to the Union that same week. It said, "It's spreading." She did not mean it as a warning. The last evening of summer came in slow and golden, the sky wide over Stedhalo's fields. Petra was sitting on the top rail of the garden fence the way she had started doing when the patrol was done, just watching. Sable was in the rows. The 2 young dragons were visible at the field's edge, shapes against the last light. Petra asked Walter what he thought would happen next. Walter looked at the garden, at Sable moving through the rows with the same slow deliberateness he had brought to a turnip bed as a hatchling small enough to hold in both hands, at the two young dragons who had eaten off plates and come back, at Petra on the fence rail, watching all of it like it was ordinary because she had grown up in it, and to her it was. Growing things, Walter said, that's what happens next. Sable raised his head and looked at Walter the way he had always looked at him, the way a creature looks when it has heard something and found it correct. Then he went back to the rows. The garden grew. Across 3 star systems, something else was growing too, quiet and certain, beginning the way most important things begin, not with ceremony or declaration, but with one small decision to be decent to something that needed it, made on a wet spring morning over a cracked egg in a turnip bed. Nobody had filed the right forms. Nobody had asked permission. It worked anyway.